good evening and welcome to episode 42 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. And here we are, not even 4 weeks yet into the new Tory government, as we discussed on last week's issue, a government that is there by fraud. The evidence continues to roll in, and it's very apparent that the postal vote was the primary tool by which the elections were manipulated. The most extreme case is still Eastbourne, and the response here direct from the local MP, but 25.2% of the vote being postal votes. I don't think so. But more of that over the coming months. We don't need to focus too much on that right now because obviously we're not going to change the outcome anytime soon. And having had the opportunity, obviously, to put his plans through Her Majesty, and she relating those plans in the speech, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or even a political analyst to comprehend that the agenda, the extreme right-wing agenda, is going to be pushed through. What this is going to mean is that there will be an increase in the underclass. And what we're going to discuss tonight is a subject that we should all be ashamed that even has to be broached. We refer to ourselves as a first world nation, yet increasingly it's becoming apparent that we have no right to that term. So it's become very evident that the establishment wants to demonise this growing underclass. And it cares not at the increase in the number of suicides, the number of people being pushed into depression, and thereby decreasing the likelihood that they will get back into employment anytime soon. Now, I'm going to be joined in a little while by John Layton, who's the operations manager with the Framework Housing Trust. And we're going to be discussing some specific case histories from a relatively small part of the country, which I think we can safely assume we can extrapolate right across the whole country. But before I do that, take a look at this 4-minute video, which pulls together some of the cases of democide, death by government. See what I mean? Ashamed to be British. Yet that is just the thin end of a very fat wedge. Now, I'm going to be joined tonight by John Layton. Now, it's quite serendipitous that I should meet with John less than, well, actually just a little over 24 hours ago. We met on the village green at Misson, a village in South Yorkshire, where we were both participating in the fracking awareness rally there. And you came to speak to me afterwards. I think you said you'd recognise me from the Voices in the Gasfields documentary. And so initially that was our point of discussion. But then we got on to what I was planning on my next project, which was to start taking a look at the underclass and the British government agenda to effectively grow this underclass and to demonise it even more. And then you shared with me that you had direct experience here. So, John, you're the operations manager with the Framework Housing Trust.
Framework Housing Association.
Sorry, Framework Housing Association. So maybe you could just give us a brief overview of the role of the Framework Housing Association.
Okay. Framework Housing Association works across Nottingham City, Nottinghamshire, parts of South Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and we have a few services in Leicestershire. So it's quite an East Midlands based organisation, and we were primarily set up in the mid '70s when a church in Nottingham discovered outside a guy called Albert who had been sleeping rough outside, and they helped him over the next few months. But one day they came back and he had frozen to death, and they decided to set up. It wasn't Framework back then. We've since merged, but we've come a long way since then. We run a host of services across the East Midlands, all sorts of services, services for homeless people, services for people suffering drug and alcohol abuse, people with mental health, learning difficulties. We have a range of different kinds of services as well. So we'll have hostel accommodation. We'll run what we call floating support. So our staff will go into people's homes and support them in their homes to maintain their tenancy, that kind of thing. We run street outreach where our team have quite a fast response in terms of a member of the public can ring a free phone number, and we will come over to the place that they've identified somebody as being homeless, and do that quite quickly and try and get them accommodated as soon as possible. And we're quite successul at that.
Now, the numbers that you shared with me yesterday were really quite staggering. I mean, I think you told me that you have something like about 11,000 people under your care, or certainly under your focus.
Yeah, last year in our annual report, we'd supported about 11,000 people. So we're a growing organisation in many ways, in as much as the amount of people needing our support is a growing number. However, with cuts to services, and that usually comes in the shape of when local authorities get their funding settlement every October. I get jittery during October because I know when it gets to October, we get the funding settlement, and inevitably there are cuts to services because the government tend to make the cuts at that time when they're setting the local authorities' budget, and it trickles downhill, if you know what I mean. So we end up having to salami slice services. You know, I set up a service about 2 years ago, and I just got the staffing in place for the new service that had been commissioned. We'd applied for the tender, we'd won the tender, and 2 weeks after we managed to get the full staff team in place, we had a 15% cut in the service. So we were left with a situation where, you know, we've hardly got off the ground, and here we are. You know, that was the kind of environment we're working in at the moment. It's a very unstable sector.
So the local authorities are effectively treating you guys as a bit of a safety net. They're assuming that they can make the cuts, and won't worry too much about the consequences because they know you guys are there to pick up the pieces.
Well, I wouldn't say that. In a lot of ways, the local authorities themselves are dealing with huge budget cuts themselves. And I have conversations with people who work in the local authority, and they take no pleasure in cutting services. So in a sense, there's a sense that we're all working in it together, really trying to find the right way forward. But there's no doubt that actually what it represents is a fundamental devaluing of our sector, and our sector is probably the only sector around that's there to deal and help people right at the bottom who are really struggling, who are clinging on with their fingertips to pay their mortgage or stay in their tenancy, or they may be struggling to feed their families or heat their houses. These are the kind of people that we're working with.
Well, I'm guessing that basically when somebody finds themselves homeless, I mean, they must at that juncture actually feel that that's it, their life is over, because they've lost that last vestige. I mean, just on the sort of basics, was it Maslow's hierarchical graph there of the basic needs, the roof over the head and food on the table, and what you lose either of those, and you've effectively lost the basic framework of life.
Absolutely. I mean, having a roof over your head is so psychologically beneficial, and it gives you a feeling of safety, of security. And really, without that, I think a lot of people don't quite understand the disastrous effects it has on people's mental health. If you consider that we talk about homeless people, and we think this person out on the streets, but actually the number of people rough sleeping is quite small. It's still significant, but it's quite small. The huge gap in that, and the huge problem that is developing, it's the people who are just transient in their housing situation. So they may be sofa surfing and finding somewhere else to live. They may not have a very good relationship with their family, so they leave their family home. They may have been in care. And then you have a situation where people are moving from place to place and never really settled. And that doesn't bode well for people's mental health.
Well, in fact, I took the statistics from your website, actually, and I've got this is a graph from your website on the rough sleeping. Yes. And, it shows there that 30% of people who sleep rough do have mental health problems, 28% drug problems, 21% alcohol problems, and 37% ex-offenders. And of course, if they're homeless, coupled with that, it pretty much means that their chances of reintegrating into society in any way, shape, or form is greatly reduced.
It absolutely is, and to be able to get to a point where someone can make a jump out of that, several things have to happen, and the trouble is they're not happening at the moment. A couple of the actions, I mean, for very vulnerable people and for people who have very troubled lives, at the moment they're completely excluded from some of the normal things that we can, that we take for granted. So in terms of healthcare, if you're homeless and you're on the streets, you don't have a doctor. If you want to get any healthcare, you have to get bad enough to go to A&E so that they'll see you. And that's just crazy that somebody can't manage their health in that way. But the real driver behind trying to address some of these problems is staring us in the face, because it's been around for a number of years. And at the moment, those, the planks of that are being pulled from under us. One of the big things that help people get out of this situation is having someone to support them. It's not rocket science. We've been doing this for years, and having a worker who treats them with respect, gives them the self-confidence and the tools, and crucially finds them somewhere to live so they feel safe and they're secure. Those very basic things can turn someone's life around quickly, and without concentrating on those basics, as you talked about Maslow, you can get nowhere. I mean, the housing situation in this country is a crisis point. there is an awful lot of empty properties around, and I think that there's a bit of a scandal brewing there in terms of why we got all these empty properties. But there's also, the scale of house building we need. We need to build new towns, not 200,000 here or 200,000 there. We need a huge house building program to try and, what the housing market's like. Try and buy something in London, it's impossible. And that's crazy.
Well, not only is it impossible to buy, of course, there's a deliberate strategy in London to remove the underclass.
Well, absolutely.
And to be considered the underclass in London actually means earning less than about 100,000 a year. But that's what they're doing. They're literally pushing all the social housing occupiers out of the city so that they can refurbish them and sell them to Russians for millions of pounds.
It does seem that way. And it makes you wonder how the capital is going to be serviced. How who are going to be the teachers, and where are they going to live? Because there is a logical extension to that kind of argument and where it goes.
Oh, exactly. Now, I want to pick up on a couple of things from your website.
Sure.
Because this is a graph that's on your website as well. How old are homeless people?
Yeah.
And of course, what is interesting to note is that evidently the most vulnerable are the 18 to 40-year-old age group. And
That's
I think I also read on the website that the largest single group is people that have been kicked out of home by their parents.
Yes,
absolutely. And now, once upon a time, maybe 30 years ago, if I'd have seen that, I'd have said, okay, that's probably, teenagers that are starting to or are becoming a bit of a problem around the house, and, the parents want to see them get on their own 2 feet, so push them out the door, force them to go get work, force them to be able to, get an apartment or whatever and pay the rent on it. Today, that's not so simple, because the jobs aren't there. And even if the jobs are there, they're probably minimum wage or 0 hours contracts. So it's very difficult for that young person to be able to earn enough to be able to be self-sufficient. But of course, that's no longer restricted to the 18 to 21 or 24-year-old age group, because you've got people in their 30s and 40s who are still living at home, not through choice, but just because they can't afford to be able to get a place on their own. So you must see a lot of people who are in that situation.
Well, inappropriately housed, yeah. I mean, to comment on the first thing that you said about it's about children leaving home. I think part of that is about that there may be people who are in a situation where they're overcrowded in the home. And a lot of people, there is the expectation that people do fly the nest. But you're quite right. The days when you could go and get a council house, are just dead and gone. I still do what we call speak out talks, and I go into different places. I'll go into schools, and I'll go to Rotary clubs and all sorts of different places to talk about framework. And when I go to schools, particularly secondary schools, there's still that perception, and I don't know where it comes from, that things will be okay. That I will be able to get a house. It will be quite easy, and I have the unenviable task of standing in front of your bright young things, 16 and 17-year-olds, telling them, no, that's really not going to be the case. You're not going to be able to find anything unless you're earning X amount and you can afford to keep yourself going in that way. So there's a perception still in society that it's easy to, things will be fine for me. Do you know what I mean? And
yet, increasingly, they're not. There's another graph that is on your website, which I found very interesting. Not too surprisingly, the largest group of people that find themselves homeless are single.
Yeah.
But single parents, 19%, 20% of people who find themselves homeless are single parents. Naively, despite the fact I can see how the agenda is unfolding, but naively, I still believe that if a person was a single parent, that they would be top of the priority in terms of social housing, but that's clearly not the case.
Well, I mean, if somebody has priority need housing, they are more likely to get accommodated. But the problem is the lack of housing. I'll tell you a story about a friend of mine who works at Framework as well. Was in the housing options office in Nottingham City. It's run by kind of Nottingham City Council a few weeks ago. Actually, it was probably a couple of months ago. And she was shocked at the sheer numbers of people who were kind of queuing out the door. There were people with, and it was packed out, there were people with kind of suitcases in there. There were children running around. It was chaos. And I think when you see that, it just brings it home to you about how much we've got this underlying problem. So it doesn't surprise me at all, because the number of children that are actually living a transient life, I mean, you alluded to it a little bit earlier yourself, with the kind of social cleansing of London, where kids are, maybe settled in a primary school or school and have been there for years and are forced to decamp to Rotherham or something. So it happens in that way, but it also happens locally, just because of the lack of affordable housing. And what happens now for homeless people, is that the local authority can discharge their duty into the private sector. So that never was the case before. When there was enough social housing, the local authority would more likely than not place somebody in social housing. But since that's dried up, and by the looks of it, that's going to get worse in the next couple of years if the Conservatives have their way with the right to buy. People are being the duty has been discharged into the private rented sector, and there are some good private rented sector landlords. We have a service that works with them as well, works with private landlords, and we try and source good private landlords to place people in good properties. However, you can imagine that the cheaper the property, it's not going to be as good as you'd want or need for a small child or something. And that problem's existing all the time. It's people are in poor accommodation, and I think one thing to say about that as well, and I just want to dispel this little myth. This myth about you hear it all. You hear it all the time, but it's a popular misconception where people will say, "Oh, people on benefits, they've got a flat screen telly, or they've got the latest iPhone, or this, that, and the other." I know from talking to my staff that some of the people they support, and I'm sure there are people with flat screen tellies. You can't buy another telly that's not flat screen these days. So, that's a bit of a spurious way of doing it. But they go into some houses, and one of my members of staff said it's like going back into a house from the 50s. Some people have absolutely nothing. They may have sold all their belongings. They've not been decorated for a while. Some houses are of a severely poor quality, and personal possessions are few and far between for some people. I'm not saying all, but this idea that people are benefit scrounging.
Well, I can corroborate that as well, because whilst I was doing the initial research into this subject, I have to say that some of the social housing that I went into was disgusting. I mean, it's that catch-22 situation. The place gets into a poor state of repair, and then the people there either haven't got the money or they haven't got the motivation to do the repairs. The housing association or whomever's providing the housing is probably struggling to get any kind of rental payments from them, and so they're not motivated to do any repairs, and so it just gets worse and worse and worse. And now we haven't touched on yet, but surely one of the most significant factors in creating the homeless problem has been the bedroom tax. And I just want to, before we go on to that, I want to address this issue, because this is a father and son. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago on Humanity versus Insanity. So this is the Keenans, And Mitchell Keenan, who is the younger of the two there, they'd been living in social housing for 40 odd years, or had been in their family for 40 years. But then when one of the brothers left home, of course, they were in a 3-bedroom house, and the Atos decided that, and DWP decided that they didn't need a 3-bedroom house. So they were sanctioned on the basis that they had a spare bedroom. So they were forced out of their housing, forced to live rough. And sadly, Mitchell Keenan ended up having to have his toes amputated because this is in Liverpool, because they had been living outside through the depths of the winter. Now, my first question is, how on earth can this happen in this country? But sadly, I know that this isn't the only incident like this. But you must see an increasing number of people effectively being forced out of their housing where they were quite comfortable. They'd learned to live on the basic benefits they got. And before anybody says, well, then they should have been getting work, I know that in many of these cases, the work wasn't available. And if there was work available, once again, it was minimum wage, £6.50 an hour, or 0 hours contracts. And basically, it just wasn't feasible for them to take that employment.
I think first thing to say is the bedroom tax is the worst piece of social engineering for legislation that I've ever seen. I think,
or from their point of view, the best.
Well, it's not worked. It's cost more money, actually.
Yeah, but it's serving a deeper agenda. But it's having the effect, isn't it, of forcing more and more people into the underclass.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely doing that. And I remember talking to a lady some months ago. She'd lived in her property for about 45 years. I think her husband had died recently. And I don't know if you know this, but if somebody's died in your property, you do get a year's grace from the bedroom tax. There is a bit of humanity there, but not a great deal. But after a year, you get the bedroom tax, and you're expected to get out. But also, people who have children and split families, where a bedroom is there for the child to visit. The DWP will have no truck with that either. It's an awful thing. We supported a lady who'd had significant amount of adaptations to her property over the years. She was disabled and in a wheelchair, and she had a spare bedroom, and they wanted her to move. And we approached the housing provider and said, do you really want to go through with this? This lady has had £40,000 worth of adaptations to her property. As it was, we were able to argue that she kept her equipment in the spare room, which was only a tiny box room. It wasn't much more than a box room. So we managed to keep her in there. But the rationale was to get her out, regardless of the fact that it made no sense to take her out of her local environment where she'd lived for a good number of years, had built up social connections, was coping as well as possible, even though she had disabilities. Makes no sense at all. And if you go up north as well, if you go to Durham, there is a housing estate up in Durham, which is just completely and is it Durham? I think it is Durham. Completely and utterly desolate. Now, there is a real need for people to have houses up there. People need accommodating. But the council can't get rid of them because they're 3-bedroomed houses, and young couples can't afford the bedroom tax. I mean, this is crazy. When a policy like this is rolled out across the board, and there's no impact assessment of this. This was entirely ideological by the government, and really the worst piece of back of the fag packet policy making I've ever seen, really.
But obviously, at the end of the day, all this is happening because we, the collective we, are allowing it to happen. But the mindset of the people. I mean, the director of housing that you just referred to, making this decision that this lady who's lived in a house for 45 years, she's seriously disabled, 40+ thousand pounds worth of modifications to enable her to be able to live, a relatively normal life. And yet, because of the pressure, they're forced to consider evicting her. I mean, what kind of mindset is it that actually allows somebody to do that? I mean, how can they actually go home to their families? How can they sleep at night knowing that they have made this kind of decision, knowing that they are probably pushing that person towards the early grave?
Well, what I would say in defence of some of the people we work with who are on the other side when we're trying to defend against things like bedroom tax, certainly a lot of social landlords we've worked with, they're in a position where they have to push this through, because from a social landlord's perspective, if your business is based on achieving a certain amount of housing benefit for each of those units, and the government have designated that a property is worth X, Y, or Z, then you're in a bit of a no-win situation as a housing provider, because do you subsidise that forevermore? Do you deal with a problem and get it done? I mean, I do take your point, but in terms of people going home and sleeping at night, I think a lot of people have been pushed into this. I don't think the government have tightened that piece of legislation was very tight by the time it got around to housing providers. It left them very little room for manoeuvre. And to go against it, I mean, there was a few local authorities who've been, leading that charge. A few local authorities that were saying we're not going to do it. I know up in, I think Leeds were quite keen to reclassify some of their large tower blocks as one bedrooms, whereas clearly they were 2 bedrooms. But I don't know how they did it, but they swung it so that the people in there didn't have to move. So, there are creative ways, but I think they got punished by the government for it in some way, shape, or form.
So sadly, I mean, and I'm sure there are people working in the local authorities or even in the DWP who are trying to find ways to actually rectify this atrocity, because that's what it is. But moving forward, I mean, sadly, if this policy continues, and of course there's every evidence to suggest that that's exactly what the current administration wants, then the prognosis, of course, is pretty clear. More and more people are going to be pushed into the underclass. More and more people are going to find themselves homeless. More and more people are going to be forced into depression and thereby find it more and more difficult to get out of that vicious loop. So how do we bring about the change? I mean, is it going to be enough to hold MPs to account, to scrutinise them on this issue and get them involved, or have they just washed their hands of it?
Well, I think in order to create some real pressure on MPs about this, I know for the last couple of years, I've run a Twitter account called Welfare Reform, and although I've not been as active as I used to be, there were a lot of people who were intent on getting the message out about people like Stephanie Bottrell that you showed a film about earlier on. People like the soldier who stored his insulin, who couldn't afford to keep his insulin cool, who died after being sanctioned. Those kind of stories need to get out there into the mainstream, because I think if we can't get those stories out into the mainstream, an awful lot of society it just doesn't come on their radar at all. And I think people are genuinely shocked when you approach them. Case in point, today I was talking about fracking, actually, as we were speaking about yesterday at Listen. We were talking about fracking, and a colleague of mine at work said, "Oh, fracking, oh, what's that then?" Really? You don't know? Okay, sit there for 20 minutes. I'm going to tell you all about it. And you're just surprised that people don't pick up on some of the obvious. So in order to address these things, we've just got to keep banging the drum and keep getting the information out there and letting people know what's actually happening. You said about the DWP and the workers at DWP. I've known a number of DWP workers who are stressed beyond belief, who go home from work and just put their head in their hands because of what they're expected to do, and they don't like it any more than we do. But they're in a job as well. And interestingly, if you've got a DWP worker working in a job centre, if you think about it, they're on part-time hours. The government. The noises from the government is they're wanting people to increase those hours, and they're going to set targets, and they're going to have interviews with the people to make sure that they move towards full-time working. Arguably, you could have a colleague sat next to you at the DWP interviewing his colleague on his left because he's still on a part-time job at the DWP. So, there are those crazy things around. So I don't tend to think that it's the people who are working in those systems. I tend to think it's the system itself, and there are an awful lot of people out there who genuinely do know what's happening, and are very supportive of organisations like mine, and the views of you as well.
Well, John, I don't believe for 1 minute that our chance meeting yesterday was pure accident. So, I'm sure that, we're going to continue this conversation. And as I said to you, fortunately, there's, over 300 groups around the country now working to raise awareness in the local community. So, there's a little bit of spare time. I mean, I'm not going to give iGas or Rathlin or Third Energy or Quadrilla the luxury of thinking that I'm retiring, because that ain't going to be the case. But I will find the time to also address this issue, because I absolutely concur. I mean, this is something that we have to raise awareness of. Like you just said, fracking's out there. It's on the media, it's on the TV, it's in the newspapers, and still people don't see it.
Yeah.
Just like there was a woman allegedly a few weeks ago who had to ask who David Cameron was. The stuff is out there, but people don't see it. And what we've got to do is get it up close and personal, and get them to understand that basically there but for the grace of God, or whatever their belief system. Nobody is immune from this. I mean, as we saw from your graph of who ends up homeless. I mean, I could argue I am technically homeless. By choice, but right now I choose to live in a caravan so that every single cent that crosses my path can be used to try and raise awareness of the atrocities that are being perpetrated upon us.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say, I remember a quote from a colleague of mine who said it to me a number of years ago, and it's still right now. She said, "John, we're all only 3 mortgage payments away from disaster."
Oh, yeah.
And that's true. And I think an awful lot of people who have never come across homelessness, or never come across, people really struggling, fail to appreciate that actually to get into that situation is quite easy to do. All it takes are 2 large life-changing events. And that may mean a loss of a job, or it may mean a breakdown of a marriage. But 2 things coming together, what we found is that that usually has quite a catastrophic effect. Now, people can handle one at a time, but I think when things start stacking up, you can find yourself very quickly in a deeply worrying position. And I'm thinking about a couple of people who we've worked with in the past. A lady called Margaret, who had basically shut herself off from the world. She'd said, I'm not having anything to do with it. She was stuffing the bills down the back of the sofa. She had mental health problems, and she was referred to us by a concerned neighbour who had not seen her for a while. Our workers went in there and managed to poke their nose through the letterbox and say hello on the first visit. It took 4 or 5 visits before we got in to see her. But eventually, when we got in to see her, she started to open up. She was on the verge of losing her home. And after a while, we did what was necessary to save all those things. She did end up moving out in the end, but we found her a more appropriate place to live. And her confidence has gone through the roof, to the extent where 2 or 3 years ago, she was delivering the keynote speech at our conference, our annual conference. And that goes for other people as well. We've had people who have been through our services and have entered the work framework. People who have had drug and alcohol problems and then come to work to support people with drug and alcohol problems. And that tells me that everybody deserves that second chance. Everybody deserves to have the respect given to them and the support to be able to turn their life around. And the trouble with that is that's not a view that I recognise in government at the moment. I don't recognise that view. All I hear about is shirkers and scroungers and denigrating the poor because they're poor. That's not going to help anybody, least of all society and least of all our economic situation, because if they've got nothing in their pockets to spend, then we're not going anywhere.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for joining me this evening, and it's definitely not going to be the last conversation that we have for sure, but we've just got a minute or so. So very briefly, if anybody's watching this and is in a situation where they are homeless or they're about to become homeless, what would you advise them to do?
Well, if they've got access to a computer, I can't remember the number offhand, but there's a free phone number you can ring. It's an 0800 number, and certainly if they're in Nottingham, that's where they need to access framework. But first of all, go to their local housing office and present at their local housing office and get as much support as you can there, and look around for any agencies that exist in your local area that offer that support. They will be out there, but sometimes it's difficult to get a hold of them. But if you go to the local housing office and ask for those details, you should get a support agency in your local area.
Excellent. Well, John, sadly, I'm afraid that your workload is probably going to increase, at least in the immediate future. But hopefully, we can find a way to turn this around. And if you are watching this and want to get involved, then why not look online and see if there's a local housing association that you may be able to volunteer with. Meanwhile, John Layton from the Framework Housing Association, thanks very much. And I will see you in 2 weeks for episode 43 of Humanity versus Insanity. Good night.